the observance on this campus of Black History Month. And it's always good to come back to St. Louis, because this city reminds me how much we owe to activists here. If Ferguson protests had not continued and continued and continued and continued, we would not have experienced what we might call the inauguration of the 21st century Black freedom movement. And so I want to acknowledge that we meet this evening on colonized land. Land that is organically linked to the histories and cultures of indigenous people in the Americas. It would be unacceptable to speak about Black history in the US without linking it to the histories of Native people who were stewards of this land long before the notion of a United States of America could be imagined. Since this is Black History Month, I think I'll begin with a few remarks regarding the history of our now relatively widespread practice of reflecting during the month of February on the history of people of African descent in this hemisphere. Originally, the second week of February was selected in 1926 by Carter G. Woodson, who has already been evoked on this platform. The second week in February was, and this is the second week in February, right? It was selected as Negro History Week. And do you know why? Do you know why that week was chosen? Well, yeah, Abraham Lincoln's birthday was on February 12th. And of course, we understand how problematic the assumption is that Lincoln freed the slaves. But nonetheless, it was symbolic. But perhaps more importantly, February 14th, this day, Valentine's Day, and serendipitously also Ash Wednesday this year, right? Work out that contradiction. Frederick Douglass did not know on exactly what day he was born, but he knew he was born in February. So he decided to celebrate his birthday on Valentine's Day because his mother, who died when he was no more than about 8 years old or so, used to call him my little Valentine. And so it would be interesting to continue to think about the coincidence of Valentine's Day and the birthday, the chosen birthday of perhaps the most prominent anti-slavery abolitionist, certainly one of the most outstanding figures in the history of the Black liberation struggle. But we might also reflect on the relationship between love and freedom, between eros and struggle. We struggle for social justice. We stand up against racism. We challenge misogyny and homophobia. We say no to those those who refuse to acknowledge the humanity of immigrants. We do all of this basically because we love each other. Basically because we love each other. The great revolutionary associated with the Cuban Revolution, Ernesto Che Guevara, once said that true revolutionaries are always guided by strong feelings of love. And so remember that. Okay? I was talking about the 1926 introduction of Negro History Week, which for many years was largely celebrated in segregated black schools. I celebrated Negro History Week when I was a child in schools, elementary schools and high school in Birmingham, Alabama, black churches, other black institutions. 50 years after Negro History Week was established, Black History Month was officially institutionalized in this country, 1976. But in the meantime, it has also come to be observed in Canada, in Britain, in the Netherlands, and in Germany, although in the UK and in Germany, it is observed during the month of October. And I understand that it may have something to do with the fact that October is one of the longer months of the year, rather than the shortest month of the year. But we get to begin our celebrations, as I always like to point out, on January 15th. And we can actually celebrate through the month of March when we observe Women's History Month. But I was thinking that it's quite interesting that some people refer to Black History Month as African American History Month, including, I think I heard Trump. We will talk about him later, but I usually don't like to mention his name so early in my talk. But it's interesting that Black History Month is sometimes referred to as African American History Month, which I think unnecessarily places national boundaries around our celebration. Black people are diasporic people with bonds of solidarity that reach around the globe. And interestingly, in the UK, Black History Month is celebrated not only by people of African and Afro-Caribbean descent, but also by people of Middle Eastern and Asian American descent. And there's a very interesting history of the emergence of a black political identity, which has a great deal to do with radical feminist struggles in the UK during the 1970s and 1980s. And the fact that black became a sign of anti-colonialist, anti-imperialist solidarity. As a matter of fact, I can remember many, many years ago, a young woman from the UK, young black woman, came to the US, and we were having conversations about women of color. And she was saying, why do you have to enumerate, why do you have to say black and Latina and so forth and so on? Why don't you just say black? And I said, well, that wouldn't work in this country. It's important to acknowledge the racialized histories of various communities that constitute what we often now refer to as communities of color. But maybe more of that later. There are those who criticize Black History Month. And you've probably heard some of the criticisms at both ends of the spectrum. We might say both ends of the racism spectrum, the anti-racist as well as those who are associated with racism. And of course, there's some who think that we shouldn't have to set aside a single month, but we should be able to celebrate Black History Month 365 days of the year. And I totally agree with that. I think we all agree with that. But then there are others who argue that such celebrations are racist, and that if we persist in observing Black History Month or Latino History Month or whatever, then there ought to also be a White History Month. You've heard those arguments, huh? Especially now. They're coming out of the woodwork. But this is the abstract equality approach that enacts racism even as it criticizes what it thinks is racism against white people. What these critics don't recognize is that whiteness has always been the unacknowledged standard for history, as well as for judging the accomplishments of humanity more broadly. Indeed, humanity, if we think about the universal concept of humanity, is still assumed to be race as white. And freedom is frequently assumed to be a white state of being. Thus, it is often taken for granted that marginalized and subjugated communities who seek freedom are basically attempting to achieve a white way of life, a white state of being. So what, therefore, is the importance of Black History Month? I don't think it resides primarily in illuminating Black individuals who have made important contributions, which is usually the way we think about Black History Month. And of course, there are Black individuals. There is a vast number of Black people who've made considerable contributions as individuals. I like to think of Black History Month as a dramatic way of challenging the racialization of history as white, Amen. As challenging the whitewashing of history. Amen. Amen. So how do we challenge the whitewashing of history? By pointing out that the quintessential meaning of humanity is freedom. Without being free, one cannot be fully human. So, racially subjugated people seeking freedom are most frequently assumed to be seeking to measure up to the idea of the human as memorialized in such documents as the Bill of Rights, in France, la Déclaration des Droits de l'Homme, and of course in France they still say Declaration of the Rights of Man. And when I'm in France, I often refer to it as droits humains, rather human rights rather than rights of man. And people are always correcting me. I know exactly what I'm saying. And this, of course, reminds us that we have to think gender as well. But what if we argued that precisely the struggles of colonized, enslaved people, people marginalized in other ways, that those struggles are not minor struggles, not minority struggles, not struggles of minorities, as we've been told we should refer to ourselves, and not struggles that need to be lined up under the major notion that the embodiment of freedom is first and foremost white. But what if we argued that these struggles constitute the real, continuous, persistent struggles for democracy in the world? And if we want to understand humanity, if we want to understand freedom, we need to look at those struggles. And so, if we think along these lines, then Black History Month will not so much consist of singling out Black individuals who have made important contributions, but it would be about celebrating the accomplishments of a people who unrelentingly refuse to surrender as they move from slavery in the direction of freedom, and over 150 years later, more than 150 years later, are still dramatically involved in the quest for freedom. Amen. So I'm arguing that Black history pivots around the struggle for collective freedom. Right. It's not the story of individuals, except insofar as individuals constitute community. It is a story of human relationality. It is a story of the collective imagination. It is a story of human empowerment of communities through struggle. And as such, this story belongs to everyone. Amen. Black history should be simply seen as a month that we as Black people use to think about the contributions we have made, but rather it needs to be thought about as the story for freedom. Right. Right. And although individual accomplishments deserve recognition, I'm not saying that we shouldn't acknowledge the first Black woman astronaut, for example, the first Black person to graduate from a four-year institution, the first Black doctor. But I don't think Black history is primarily about firsts. It is about the uplift of community. The Black Women's Club movement chose as its motto, lifting as we climb, lifting as we climb. So Black history is not a set of lessons with the theme, Black people can do it too. We're just as intelligent as white people. Amen. Which of course we are, but what's the point of trumpeting this around when basically it signifies that we want to be treated better by white people because white is the sign of humanity. Black people, indigenous nations, Chicano, Latinx communities, Muslim women and men, Asian American people are about creating new standards, which I think are also designed to alter the meaning of whiteness. So let's keep that in mind as well. And to repeat, Black History Month is not about centering Black individuals who have excelled so that the rest of the Black community can receive the message that we can be like white people too. It is about freedom. And as a matter of fact, I like to repeat the fact that the Black Lives Matter movement, when it emerged, received responses by those who argued that it was counterproductive to simply say that Black lives matter. That people should have been saying that all lives matter. You heard about that, right? And what they did not understand was that the point was that if Black lives ever truly mattered in the world, then all lives would have to matter as well. Logic, not the logic that erase erase those who are considered minor by deploying universals like all lives, like humanity. I want to talk about an example. And one of the reasons I want to evoke this example has to do with remarks that the person who presently occupies the seat of executive in Washington. You remember a few weeks ago, he made these very disparaging remarks about African countries and Haiti. And I won't repeat what he said. But let me say a few words about Haiti. Because Haiti is generally represented as one of the most impoverished, if not the most impoverished country in the world. But I want to suggest that whatever modicum of freedom we might experience today, whatever inspiration we generate to continue the freedom struggle, we owe to those men and women who fought with Toussaint Louverture. The Haitian Revolution, which resulted in the first non-racial democracy in the entire world. And of course, we're not suggesting that there were many problems in Haiti, but the idea that democracy could exist in places like France and the U.S., but that it was confined actually to a minority of people. And we don't often think about the contradiction between democracy, which is supposed to mean that all people hold the power, right? And the fact that in both France and the US, well, first of all, it was only men, because women of all racial backgrounds were excluded. Women didn't even get the right to vote in the U.S. until, does anybody know? When? Okay, yeah. It's usually said women got the right to vote in 1920. Voted in the 1920 election. And we say that, no. But black women didn't get the right to vote. And so how can we say that women got the right to vote in 1920? Example of that logic that I was talking about that compels us to think in terms of whiteness. The majority of black women didn't get the right to vote until 1965 with the Voting Rights Act. Let's not forget that. Well, anyway, I was talking about Haiti. And I was referring to the fact that in France and the US, which were supposed to be the two major examples of modern democracy, the majority of people did not participate in that democracy. And certainly, in both cases, it was a racialized democracy. It was a democracy for white people. And so what's interesting in Haiti, in one of the constitutions, I believe it was the 1805 Constitution, citizens were defined as black. So that, which kind of reverses that logic. So it meant that a white person who was a citizen of Haiti would be black. And I think it was a way of representing what we strive for in terms of democracy as having black historical contours, right? This was an instance where the Haitians wanted to make it absolutely clear that they weren't simply striving to be white, but rather they were striving to be free. And they were redefining the meaning of freedom. And so, if you know the history of Haiti, you know that the French stole Haitian resources. And despite this theft of Haitian resources, and you know that history, right? That after the success of the Haitian Revolution, Haiti was compelled to pay France for every single individual who had been a slave. So the French insisted on payment for lost property, for the loss of human property. And in that way, they asserted a kind of permanence of slavery, even as Haiti was attempting to extricate itself from the legacies of this institution. Frederick Douglass, more than a century ago, said, and I'm quoting, "Haiti has taught the world about the danger of slavery and the value of liberty and the value of liberty. In this respect," Douglass said, "she has been the greatest of all of our modern teachers." And you know that Haiti actually ended up giving France 90 million gold francs between the period of 1825 and 1947. And that amounts to $21 billion in today's currency. And Haiti is referred to as the poorest country in the world. We know that in every important struggle against slavery in the US and elsewhere, there were resonances with the Haitian Revolution, the insistence by women and men who came to call themselves Haitians, that to be human is to collectively struggle to be free. There's no such thing as the freedom of a single individual. And we know that freedom, as it has been conceived under bourgeois democracies, capitalist democracies, has always been a limited freedom. Has always been the freedom accorded to class and racial and gender elites. A freedom that acquires its value precisely through its powers of exclusion. Exclusion based on race and class and gender and sexuality. As a matter of fact, you might think about the fact that slavery served as slavery provided an oppositional manner of defining freedom. That is to say, white people knew they were free only because they were not slaves. That is how freedom was defined. You know, I was thinking that if Donald Trump would sit down and read this amazing book by C.L.R. James about Haiti, which is called The Black Jacobins, then he would perhaps better understand the historical role the Haitian people have played and would have not so cavalierly argued that Haitians should not be allowed into the U.S. But then, I mean, by his own admission, Trump doesn't read. And I know he doesn't read books. Can you imagine? Can you imagine someone who is the president of the U.S. who doesn't read? Well, anyway, yeah. But the point that I'm making is that, and I frame this part of my